Hello. For my crime, I chose to study prostitution. It is known that long before human beings were fully human, males have in general wanted more sex than females were willing to supply. By the basic laws of economics, any demand will inevitably be met by someone willing to supply, if the price is right. Chimpanzees are even known to trade food for sex. And every human society ever has recorded a certain fraction of women who provide sex to men outside of a formal relationship for a fee. On this slide, you can see that I found the definition of prostitution from the penal law and criminal procedure law. And in order to properly define the crime of prostitution, I would like to refer to Article 230 in the New York State Penal Code. The definition of prostitution, according to the Penal Code, is as follows. A person is guilty of prostitution when such person engages or agrees or offers to engage in sexual conduct with another person in return for a fee. Article 230 also states that prostitution is a Class B misdemeanor. This slide really starts to dive into the prostitution classifications and punishments. So on this slide, you can see that I've listed classifications on the left of the screen and the list of possible punishments associated with different acts of prostitution on the right of the screen. I'd like to start by explaining the 6 main classifications of prostitution. The first one on the classification list is brothel employees. They are dedicated locations where people pay for sex and sometimes include saunas and massage parlors. Next is window workers. Now these are very commonly found in Amsterdam, which I visited Amsterdam a couple years back and walked through the red light district. And it is very disturbing to know that these women are offered money and they have to solicit themselves so much and they just look unhappy, very unhealthy, but I guess they have a bunch of laws and regulations that I'm really not too aware of. But the women that are on display are there to entice the individuals that pass by, usually on a populated street, and for the people that are passing to enter the house of prostitution. Almost all Amsterdam window rooms are only single occupancy. This helps so you can pick a girl more easily. Third is an independent call girl / escort. With this type of prostitution, the escorts work for themselves in hotels and private buildings, like houses, and they charge high prices, and they stay away from the public eye as much as they can. They usually advertise online ads they get to keep their profits since they are self-employed. Next is escort agency employees. These employees thrive on independent call girls. These employees work in a private location or hotel and share relatively high prices as well. This involves moderate exploitation for the girls, since they must give a cut of their earnings to their agencies. Next are the bar and casino workers. These are sex workers that make initial contact with men at a bar or casino, and then they take them to a separate location to have sex. Lastly, and most commonly known, is the streetwalker. These prostitutes earn little money and are vulnerable to high exploitation. These individuals get paid less than indoor prostitutes, and streetwalking is very dangerous. We're going to focus on the right now, and I would like to point out some of the punishments, and we're going to go into depth of what some of these entail. So, a person is guilty of promoting prostitution in the 4th degree when he or she knowingly advances or profits from the prostitution. A person that is acting as anything other than a prostitute or a patron advances prostitution when they knowingly cause or aid a person to commit or engage in prostitution, when they procedures or solicits patrons for prostitution, if they provide persons or a premises for prostitution purposes, if they operate or assist in the operations of a house of prostitution or a prostitution enterprise. Even if they engage in or conduct institutions designed to help with prostitution, or facilitate an act or enterprise of prostitution. A person profits from prostitution when they accept money of some value in pursuit to an agreement with any person who participates in the proceeds of prostitution activities, and when they act in other ways than as a prostitute, receiving compensation for personally rendered services. Next is the compelling prostitution. This occurs when a person 21 years old knowingly advances prostitution by compelling a person less than 16 years old by forcing or intimidating that individual to engage in prostitution acts. An individual is guilty of permitting prostitution when they have possession or control of a premise which he or she knows is being used for prostitution purposes. The person fails to make reasonable effort to halt or abate such use. On the next slide, you can see I displayed a brief history of prostitution starting in 2400 BC to relatively present times. So starting in 2400 BC, the Sumerians had a word for female prostitute, which was something of the kind of car kid. This was found on one of the earliest lists of professions and is believed to be in connection with temple services. The term kurgaru is a male prostitute or transvestite entertainer that was found on this same list. These are links that relate to the practices of the cult of Ishtar, where transvestites performed acts using knives. On that same list was female occupations, which included lady doctor, scribe, barber, and a cook. Back then, these were obvious signs of prostitution. Moving down the timeline, in 1780 BC, they found that 6 of the 282 codes of the familiar Hammurabi specifically mentioned the rights of a prostitute or child of a prostitute. Next, in 1158, this is now AD, the Holy Roman Army punished prostitution. When they were caught in the act, the prostitute was ordered to have her nose cut off in an attempt to make her less attractive, and the soldier that was caught in the act sometimes had a finger cut off or an eye removed. In 1490s, the Great Pox, otherwise known as syphilis, ravaged through Europe for almost a century. The recognition of this venereal nature of infection and the disease resulted in a reaction against prostitution. In 1617, Japan created Yoshiwara, their red light district, on the edge of the city, which gathered all legal brothels in and out of the way in one spot. It was relocated in 1656 and later burned down, only a short year later. Yoshiwara was rebuilt in 1659 and was then permitted to carry on nighttime operations, were prohibited in the Old Quarter. Moving down to 1699 brought the regulations of prostitution in colonial America. Prostitution was not an offense in either English or American common law, and prior to World War I, prostitute was not an offense, but it was generally regulated as a specific sort of vagrancy. When prostitutes were punished as sexual deviants, it was under laws against adultery or fornication, or for being common nightwalkers. From the 1960s to the 1980s, prostitution began to flourish in the colonial New York. Colonial America was a seaport, and the prostitution flourished in the streets and taverns close to the docks. New York remarked John Watt in the 1760s. This was known as the worst school for youth of any of His Majesty's dominions. Ignorance, vanity, dress, and dissipation being the reigning characteristics of the kids' lives. On the eve of the Revolution, over 500 ladies of pleasure kept lodging continuous within the consecrated liberties of St. Paul's Chapel, just a few blocks north at the entrance of the college. Robert claimed that dozens of prostitutes provided temptation to the youth that had occasions to pass often. More recently, in 1902, New York's Committee of 15 was formed to examine how New York City should treat prostitution. Its 1902 report showed the social evil opposed regulations and included recommendations such as improvements to housing, healthcare, and increasing women's wages. A couple years later, in 1905, the American Society of Sanity and Moral Prophylax was formed by Dr. Price to combat venereal diseases and prostitution. The organization thought municipalities can better devote their energies to teaching and warning against her than in regulating her in business. Education is cheaper and more effective. In 1959, Britain legalizes prostitution based on the recommendation of the Wolfenden Report. Britain decriminalized prostitution but banned solicitation and other related activities with the Street Offence Act of 1959. Skipping ahead, in 2013, Zurich, Switzerland landed drive in sex boxes. Prostitution is legal in Switzerland, but the law offers little to no protection to the women themselves. The city then said that soliciting on the streets will be forbidden, and instead prostitutes and their clients will be expected to use a custom-built compound on an industrial site in the Zurich suburbs. On the driver's side of the box is very narrow, making it difficult for him, or her, to get out of the car. On the passenger side, there is plenty of space and an alarm button, as well as an emergency exit for the prostitutes doing their job. In 2014, Canada banned the purchase of sex, but not the sale. They criminalize the purchase of sexual services and restricts the advertisement of sexual services and communication in public for the purpose of prostitution. And finally, in 2016, the most recent that I have found, France also bans the purchase of sex but not the sale of sex. Legislators approved a bill against prostitution and sex trafficking that bans buying sex but not selling it as well. Moving forward with more history of prostitution is just to focus on the United States. So this slide focuses on the brief history of prostitution in the United States beginning in the 19th century. So back then, which is similar to today's society, business people will often go where others feared to go. The fraction of sex workers among the earliest settlers in any land is always disproportionately high. In many western frontier towns, they were virtually the only women to be found. During these times, prostitution was accepted as a fact of life, even by those who disapproved of it. In the late 19th century, known as the Age of Steam, made it possible for large numbers of people to move about the globe freely thanks to the steam engine. Many of the migrants chose to seek fortunes in the United States. However, when the Chinese immigrants began to pour into California, white Americans began to fear their arrival. They feared their arrival because most female Chinese immigrants at the time were either prostitutes or second wives in polygamous marriages. So in 1875, Congress passed the Page Law, which banned the immigration of women for lewd and immoral purposes. This law did not help the immigration of Chinese, however. In the early 20th century, America was consumed with moral fever to rescue the helpless damsels in distress from sex and autonomy. In 1910, Congress passed the infamously vague White Slave Traffic Act, or better known as the Mann Act. In the next 4 years, early American state criminalized prostitution itself, regardless of whether the woman was coerced or not. In the 1950s, escort services started to become popular, and for the most part, enforcement of law concentrated on street workers, the smallest but most visible segment of the market, roughly 15% of all American sex workers. Those charged found themselves permanently stigmatized and unable to get other work because of the criminal record. Next, Margot St. James, who founded Coyote, the first sex workers' rights organization in 1973, argued that state controls of women's sexual behavior was something the young feminist movement should fight, and many feminists agreed. In 1976, Coyote filed the lawsuit, which would eventually, in 1980, lead to the settlement which decriminalized prostitution in Rhode Island, until it was recriminalized by new legislation in 2009. All of this unfortunately ended with the AIDS epidemic, which allowed those who oppose sexual freedom to gain dominance both in the feminist movement and among the public. After a lull of almost 2 decades, the U.S. sex workers' rights movement inspired the achievements of activists in Europe and Australia. The internet made advertising and client screening cheap and easy and has enabled more sex workers than ever to work independently and out of sight of police. The streets part of the prostitution market is now smaller than it has ever been. At the same time, the internet has allowed sex workers to speak for themselves via blogging and social media, allowing many more people to learn the truth of their lives. And in 2012, the United Nations adopted a policy of encouraging and decriminalizing encouraging the decriminalization of sex work and many other prominent human rights organizations as well. So on this slide, I'd like to explain a couple of theoretical perspectives of prostitution. So the first one is functionalism, and prostitution is functional for several parties today, and prostitutes benefit from having a source of income, and while it provides a sexual alternative for men who lack a sexual partner or are dissatisfied. And Kingsley Davis believes that prostitution helps keep the divorce rate lower than it would if prostitutes didn't exist. Next is conflict theory. Prostitution arises from women in poverty and in patriarchal society. It also reflects the ongoing cultural treatment of women as sex objects. Finally, the last perspective is symbolic interactionism. Prostitutes and their customers have a variety of ways they understand each other's behavior, and this helps them justify why they engage in this behavior. Many prostitutes believe they are performing important services for their customers, and this belief may be more common among indoor prostitutes than street prostitutes. This next slide is a little different because it's about the victimization in prostitution, and it is a common thought that or question that arises that prostitution really is a victimless crime. And since there are so many conflicting feelings on whether prostitution is truly a victimless crime or not, I would like you guys to comment on my video with 1 or 2 sentences on why or why not you believe that prostitution is a victimless crime. Personally, I believe that there are a multitude of directions that one may take when answering this question. I'll briefly say that I believe prostitution is both a victimless crime as well as a victim crime. I believe in certain situations the customer can be the victim and the prostitute themselves can be the victim. Well, there is a victim of themselves, of the crime, or a variety of other reasons. So this slide is trends found in why one chooses prostitution, and there are a lot of different reasons, and here I just list, a little more than a handful, and I'll go into some of them. So economic factors are one of the biggest reasons that individuals choose prostitution. Economic factors that act as motives that lead to prostitution are the most widespread and primary factors. People who are dealing with poverty, displacement, or unemployment, or who are refugees or immigrants are more likely to be forced into prostitution. This is due to the lack of economic option or due to the lack of legal and social protections, or a combination of both. If it were not for the money involved in prostitution in each region, rates of prostitution would drop drastically. Economic causes and motivations is the primary factor for persistence of prostitution in this country and the world. There is an exhaustive list of factors which demonstrates the extent to which prostitution is not a choice for many individuals, including gender discrimination, race discrimination, poverty, abandonment, debilitating sexual and verbal abuse, poor or no education, and a job that does not pay a living wage. There is an abundance of social issues as well, in which may directly contribute to the proliferation of prostitution. In one study where the prostitutes themselves were interviewed about the causes of their entry into a life of sex work, many of them claimed access and affordability of drugs as a primary factor, and a sizable number of women were drug addicts. 8 of the 12 women indicated that an existing drug addiction spurred their engagement in prostitution. Lastly, geography has a unique effect on the act of prostitution. It was found that by simply living in an area where prostitution is prominent, this may make a decision or the inevitability of entering the prostitution is far more likely considered. There is 38.4% of home neighborhoods as a region of location. This next slide shows a couple of graphs. The first one is most common recruitment venues for prostitution and pimps. And you can see there's highest is social networking. It goes down to your home neighborhoods, clubs and bars, other neighborhoods, the internet, track at school, the mall, and different parts of transit stations, trains, buses, all that. And the last one is, or the bottom one, is the estimate of different John Does in different areas that participate in prostitution. So blue is a low estimate, red is the high estimate, and on the left you can see some different countries that have participated. Here are just a few of my references that I used to find some of the information. Thank you for listening.